Okay, here we are, and today we will be discussing some facts about Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf was one of the most important literary voices of the whole 20th century. A large part of the things that we talk about, we discuss, are due to the work of Virginia Woolf. She was not only a novelist, she was a novelist, a very important critic, and a publisher. Her critical work, for example, is very important for the feminist movement because she published, among many essays and lectures, the text A Room of One's Own, which advocated for space and time for women to write literature. You can find a lot of material on this work, but we will not discuss it here. Just know that she wrote that, and is very important for the feminist movement. And as a publisher, she founded with her husband. She founded the publishing house Faber and Faber, which was the publisher, for example, for Eliot's The Wasteland. So she has a very important role also in spreading the work of other writers. She was part of this so-called, let's say, society called the Bloomsbury Group, which we will discuss later on, and somehow she led a very unconventional life. Being part of the Bloomsbury Group was a large element of this unconventionality, but also she had, in a way, a very open marriage, and we will talk about it. She suffered of nervous breakdowns. She was probably bipolar or something like that. And in 1941, in one of the hardest moments of this mental stress, she committed suicide by drowning herself in a river. Okay, let's move on and let's talk about the Bloomsbury Group for a minute. Bloomsbury Group was a very important group of artists, philosophers, economists, and so on. So it was an intellectual and social club. It's called Bloomsbury Group because they met in a house in a very fashionable square in London, if I'm not mistaken. It's Russell Square in the neighborhood of Bloomsbury, so that's hence the name. Many important thinkers of the 20th century were members of this group. Virginia Woolf was one of them. Bertrand Russell was another. Painter Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant were other members of this group. And another one was poet and artist Vita Sackville-West. The name was, we'll come back, we'll talk about it. So they were very radical and avant-garde. They rejected traditional morality and lifestyle. And with traditional morality, we can tell something about Virginia Woolf's life, because even though she was married to Leonard Woolf, she had a long-term relationship with Vita Sackville-West, who we just mentioned. We don't know for sure. We cannot be 100% sure that they had a sexual relationship as well, but they were very involved with each other. So if you think about the Victorian morality, this relationship was something that was totally inconceivable in the previous century, but this group rejected the whole morality connected with the Victorian age, so they lived in a much different way than, for example, artists of the previous century. Let's talk about then some of the main elements of Virginia Woolf's style. She, like Joyce, uses the technique of the stream of consciousness, and as we already know, this technique describes the unfiltered thoughts of the character. We'll see how Virginia Woolf uses this technique in a different way if compared to James Joyce. For example, we will not see pages and pages of extreme interior monologue like Ulysses' final chapter, because Virginia Woolf respects the language structure, and in a way her prose is much richer and much more musical and cinematic and rhythmic compared with Joyce's prose. Let's deal with this for a minute more. Both Virginia Woolf and Joyce use the technique of the stream of consciousness, but Joyce, as we have seen, take it to an extreme formal result. Molly Bloom's monologue is the literal transcription of each single thought and each single idea that crosses Molly's mind while she's lying in bed. Virginia Woolf instead remains faithful to the structure of the English language, and it follows structural rules, but she makes a really deep and careful work on rhythm, on the cinematic structure of her work. We'll see that later on, and on the prose. In a way, Virginia Woolf's prose is both easier to understand than the hardest parts of Joyce, and it is also more beautiful, even though it is not necessarily the correct word. It's much more rhythmic, much more musical, much more cinematic than Joyce's prose. Virginia Woolf employs the elements called moments of being, which are very similar to Joyce's epiphany. We will see how in Mrs Dalloway these moments of being are not necessarily linked to paralysis, as we have seen in Dubliners and also in Ulysses in part. Joyce's characters are paralyzed in their situation, while Mrs Dalloway is an example of a character who is changed by what happens to her. So let's talk about Mrs Dalloway. Mrs Dalloway, just like Ulysses, is set in one day. Now we are in June, just like Ulysses, but in 1923, so it's later on. And just like Ulysses, it follows this day in the life of these two main characters. But these two main characters don't know each other and barely cross each other. They don't even meet. They don't know them. They don't know one another. We'll see in the extract that we'll look at later on how they cross each other without noticing one another. Time, once again, is an important element. since this story is set in London, the bells of the Big Ben play an important role, and clocks and watches also mark an important element which mark the evolution of the story. In the end, one of the two main characters, Septimus, commits suicide, and even though Clarissa Dalloway does not meet him or gets to know him, Septimus' death has an important influence on her character development. So let's spend a bit on these characters. The main one, and one of the characters that we meet in the extract, is Clarissa Dalloway. The novel is titled after her. She's an upper middle class woman. She's the wife of a Conservative MP. She's a very ordinary, in many ways, upper middle class woman. She's 51, and we meet her while she's buying flowers for a party that she's giving that same night. We will see how she changes during these days. The other main character is Septimus Warren Smith. He's a middle-class man, he's a clerk, and he was formerly a poet, and also, very important, he fought in World War I, and he came back from the war shell-shocked. Today we would say that he is suffering from post-traumatic stress disease. At that time, they say that he was shell-shocked, and this shell-shock and the guilt that he feels for the death of one of his companions during the war, in the end, lead him to commit suicide during this day. And his death is a very important element for Clarissa, because even though they don't know each other, she feels in a way very close to Septimus' character, but she finds in herself the strength. She has a moment of being, and she finds herself the strength to overcome her paralysis and go on with her life, to overcome her existential suffering in a way, and to go on with her life. So let's have a look at the extract. We will point out some elements that are interesting, but you will find that there are also other elements. I will try to point them out. So here it is. This is the one that you have on your books. Let's start by having a look at the first line. If you see the highlighted part, it's very clear that we're talking about a stream of consciousness, and at the same time we have punctuation, we have capital words, we have a third person narration, so we can see how this stream of consciousness is much different than the technique employed by Joyce. So we are now we are looking at the thoughts made by Clarissa Dalloway. And here we don't have just her thoughts, just like it happens in Molly Bloom's case, but here you will notice that we feel her feelings, and we feel Clarissa's what Clarissa feels with her senses. We can smell the perfume of the flowers, we hear what she hears, and so on. So it's the difference is that here, in a way, it's a much more traditional kind of narration, but at the same time, we are using the same stream of consciousness technique because we are our point of view is absolutely inside not only the mind, the soul and the senses of this character. Here we have another very important element of this extract, because all of these extracts can be seen in a way as a long sequence shot. If this were a movie, we probably could shoot this whole part without cutting on the camera, just like, for example, it happens in 1917, the film that some of you have watched just before the quarantine started. Here we have a camera movement that, without cutting from one character to the other, moves our point of view from Clarissa to Septimus and to Septimus' wife. Here there's one noise made by a car that catches the attention of the characters in the first part of the paragraph. And while following the sight, the gaze, Clarissa's gaze on this car, we see the camera and the point of view moving from Clarissa to other characters in the street, watching that same car stopping near the flower shop where the scene started, and then moving to Septimus Warren Smith. We have the description of the character, and then we have the wife in the end of this extract thinking about Septimus's situation, because we notice that Septimus is not 100% okay. But all of this happens in just like in a sequence shot. Without any cutting to other characters. We move from Clarissa to other characters. For example, this Edgar J. Watkins, who talks in sort of a London slang, because the Prime Minister's car is obviously saying the Prime Minister's car, but here Woolf is trying to convey us the way this character speaks. And then Septimus Warren Smith, who found himself unable to pass, heard him. So we're moving from Edgar J. Watkins, who appears for this brief couple of lines, to Septimus Warren Smith. The camera moves and we start talking about him. So this is an example of this very advanced, in a way, cinematic technique, and very modern at the time, because in the 20s cinema started to be filmed this way. Camera started to move while shooting films. They were not just placed somewhere and like, for example, shooting theater. Here cinema is starting to evolve, and literature evolves as well. So this part is very interesting because of this cinematic technique and the use of the stream of consciousness that is quite different from the one employed by Joyce, but just as powerful and possibly even more fascinating than Joyce's. So this more or less concludes our discussion here. So thank you and see you next time.